There's a gas station in rural Montana that appears on no official maps. No GPS can find it, no satellite image shows it, yet every night dozens of truckers stop there for fuel. They call it the Phantom Stop, and what happens inside changes them forever. I worked there for 6 months. What I discovered will make you question everything you know about reality. My name is Jake Morrison, and until last year I was just another long-haul trucker running roads across the western states. I'd been driving for 15 years, knew every truck stop, every shortcut, every good place to grab a meal between Denver and Seattle. Or at least I thought I did. It was October 15th when I first saw the sign. I was running late on a delivery to Billings, pushing through a nasty storm that had knocked out my GPS. Rain was hammering my windshield so hard I could barely see the road ahead. That's when I spotted it through the darkness. A faded blue sign that simply read, "Fuel, next right." I almost drove past. The exit wasn't on any map I'd ever seen, and I'd been running this route for years. But my fuel gauge was sitting dangerously low, and in that storm I couldn't risk running empty. So I took the turn. The road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before opening into a small clearing. That's where I saw it. A single-story building with 2 ancient-looking gas pumps out front. The neon sign above the door flickered between open and static, casting eerie shadows across the empty parking lot. I pulled up to the pumps and stepped out into the rain. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Despite the storm, I could barely hear the wind or rain once I was standing next to the building. It was like the place existed in its own pocket of quiet. The gas pumps looked like they belonged in a museum. No credit card readers, no digital displays, just old mechanical counters that clicked as the fuel flowed, but the gas was good. And the price per gallon was at least 50 cents cheaper than anywhere else I'd seen. I was about to head inside to pay when another truck pulled up. The driver was an older guy, maybe 60, with tired eyes and calloused hands. He nodded at me as he started filling his tank. "First time?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Didn't know this place existed?" He smiled, but there was something odd about his expression. "Most people don't. You'll find out why soon enough." Before I could ask what he meant, he finished fueling and drove off into the storm. I watched his taillights disappear into the darkness, feeling strangely uneasy. Inside, the station looked like it had been frozen in time. Wood-paneled walls, a checkerboard floor that might have been installed in the 70s, and shelves stocked with snacks and drinks I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Behind the counter sat a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the palest blue eyes I'd ever seen. "That'll be $42.50, she said before I could even tell her which pump I'd used. I handed over the cash, trying not to stare. "How did you know?" "I always know," she replied with that same odd smile the trucker had given me. "You're Jake Morrison, aren't you?" My blood ran cold. I'd never been to this place before, never met this woman, never even knew it existed until 20 minutes ago. "How do you know my name?" "Same way I know you're running behind on a delivery to Billings. Same way I know you're going to be back here in 3 weeks. She handed me my change, her fingers ice cold when they brushed mine. "My name's Elena. I run this place." I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her eyes told me the conversation was over. I grabbed a coffee and a bag of chips and headed for the door, eager to get back on the road and put this strange encounter behind me. But as I reached for the door handle, Elena called out one more time, "Jake, when you come back, ask me about the basement." I drove away that night with more questions than answers, but life on the road has a way of pushing strange encounters to the back of your mind. I had deadlines to meet, bills to pay, and 1,000 miles of highway ahead of me. Within a week, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Almost, because 3 weeks later, to the day, I found myself taking that same unmarked exit, I wasn't even running the same route. I was hauling electronics from Sacramento to Minneapolis, a path that should have taken me nowhere near that stretch of Montana highway. But there I was, my GPS showing me in the middle of nowhere, following road signs that led me right back to Elena's station. This time the parking lot wasn't empty. 3 other trucks sat beside the pumps, their drivers nowhere to be seen. I recognized one of them. It belonged to Carlos Martinez, a driver I'd known for years. Carlos ran routes between Phoenix and Portland, which meant he had no business being in rural Montana either. I found him inside the station, sitting at a small table near the back, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Carlos?" I called out. "What are you doing here?" He looked up at me with vacant eyes as if he was seeing me from a great distance. "Jake? I don't know. I was driving through Nevada and then..." He shook his head, confusion clouding his features. "I can't remember how I got here." Elena appeared beside our table as if she'd materialized from thin air. "He'll remember when it's time," she said calmly. "Same as you will." "Remember what?" I demanded. "Why you keep coming back? Why you can't stay away?" She gestured toward the door behind the counter that I hadn't noticed during my first visit. Ready to see the basement. Every instinct told me to leave, to walk out that door, get back in my truck and never look back. But I couldn't. It was as if an invisible force was pulling me toward that door, toward whatever secrets lay beneath this impossible place. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, leading down into darkness that seemed to swallow Elena's flashlight beam. The air grew colder with each step, and I could hear something that might have been machinery humming in the distance. "What is this place?" I whispered. "A way station," Elena replied. "One of 12 scattered across North America. We've been here since before the highways were built, before the first European settlers arrived. We serve those who travel between worlds." At the bottom of the stairs, she flicked on a series of overhead lights, revealing the most impossible sight I've ever witnessed. The basement was enormous, far larger than the building above could possibly contain. Dozens of old-fashioned gas pumps lined the walls, each one connected to a different vehicle. But these weren't trucks or cars. They were machines I couldn't begin to identify. Some looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, all gleaming metal and pulsing lights. Others seemed to be made of materials that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury. And the drivers weren't human, at least not entirely. One was tall and impossibly thin, with skin that looked like polished stone and eyes that glowed with their own light. Another had the basic shape of a person but seemed to be composed entirely of shifting shadows. A third looked almost normal until you noticed that its face was slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to draw a human from memory and gotten the proportions just a little off. They all turned to look at me as Elena and I descended the stairs, and I felt their attention like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "Don't be afraid," Elena said softly. "They're travelers, just like you. They need fuel for their journeys, just like you do." "But I'm not like them," I stammered. "I'm human. I drive a regular truck on regular roads." Elena smiled that enigmatic smile again. "Do you?" "Think carefully, Jake. When was the last time you saw another car on the highway? When was the last time you spoke to your dispatcher? When was the last time you were really, truly sure about where you were going?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. Now that she mentioned it, I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen civilian traffic. For months, maybe longer. I'd been driving on empty highways, following routes that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't paying attention. I'd been calling my dispatcher, but had he ever really answered, or had I just been leaving messages that went into the void? "The roads you travel aren't entirely in this world anymore," Elena continued. "They exist in the spaces between realities, connecting places that shouldn't be connected. Most drivers never notice because they pass through quickly. But some, like you, start to slip between the cracks. You become part of the network." I looked around the basement again, seeing it with new eyes. The strange vehicles, the impossible drivers, the space that was larger inside than outside, it all started to make a horrible kind of sense. What happened to me? I asked. You took a wrong turn somewhere, Elena said. Maybe it was a construction detour that led you down a road that shouldn't exist, maybe. You followed GPS directions that weren't entirely accurate, and maybe you just got tired and took an exit that looked familiar but wasn't quite right. It doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is that you're here now and you're starting to see the truth. One of the strange drivers approached us, the one that looked almost human but not quite. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dry leaves. New traveler, it said, tilting its head to study me. You still smell of the old roads, how long since you last saw home. I tried to remember when had I last been home. I had an apartment in Denver, or at least I thought I did, but when was the last time I'd actually been there? The memories felt fuzzy, like trying to recall a dream. I don't know, I admitted. Time works differently here, Elena explained. Days can pass like minutes, or minutes can stretch into hours. The important thing is the journey, not the destination. But I have deliveries to make, I protested, schedules to keep. Do you? Elena asked gently. Or are you just carrying cargo from one way station to another, keeping the network running? Think about your last few deliveries, Jake. Where did you pick up the cargo? Where did you drop it off? I tried to remember, but the details slipped away like smoke. Warehouses that might have been anywhere or nowhere, loading docks that existed in permanent twilight, shipping manifests that seemed to change when I wasn't looking directly at them. What's happening to me? I whispered. You're becoming what you were always meant to be, Elena said. A carrier, a bridge between worlds. Your truck doesn't just transport goods anymore, it transports possibility itself. Over the following weeks, I learned to accept my new reality. I still drove my routes, but now I understood what I was really doing. The cargo I carried wasn't just freight, it was dreams, memories, fragments of reality that needed to be moved from one place to another. Sometimes I transported hope from a dying world to one just being born. Sometimes I carried the nightmares to places where they could be safely contained. The other drivers I met at Elena's station became something like a family. There was Maria, who looked human but cast no reflection in mirrors. She'd been driving for 30 years, transporting art and music between dimensions where creativity was banned and others where it was desperately needed. There was something called Void Walker, which appeared as a constantly shifting silhouette. It carried messages between beings so alien that their thoughts couldn't exist in normal space without burning through reality itself. And there was Thomas, who had once been human like me, but had been driving the interdimensional highways for so long that he'd started to fade, becoming translucent around the edges. He specialized in transporting lost things, missing persons, forgotten memories, abandoned dreams. The key, Thomas told me one night as we sat in Elena's station, sharing coffee and impossible stories, is not to fight it. The roads chose you for a reason. You have something they need: stability, humanity, the ability to anchor strange cargo in familiar form. But what about my old life? I asked. My apartment, my friends, my normal deliveries, they're still there in a way, Thomas said. Time isn't linear on these roads, you can go back if you really want to. But most of us find that the old world feels flat after you've seen what's really out there. He was right. I tried going back once, took a route that led me to Denver and my old apartment. But everything felt wrong. The colors were too pale, the sounds too quiet, the very air too thin. I lasted 3 days before I found myself back on the highway, drawn inexorably toward another unmarked exit, another impossible delivery. The hardest part was learning to trust my cargo. Some of it was beautiful, crystallized laughter from children who had never known sadness, bottled sunlight, from a world where stars sang. But some of it was dangerous. I once transported a container of pure rage that had to be kept frozen at absolute zero, destined for a war-torn dimension where it would be refined into something resembling justice. Another time I carried a box of extinct languages, each word wrapped in silence to keep them from escaping and rewriting reality around them. Elena taught me how to handle the more dangerous shipments. Everything has its place, she would say, as she showed me the proper containment procedures. Your job isn't to judge the cargo, just to deliver it safely. Trust that there are people on both ends who know what they're doing. But there were times when I wondered if that trust was misplaced. Once, I delivered a shipment to what looked like an abandoned warehouse in the middle of a desert that shouldn't have existed. The receiving crew looked human but moved with the fluid grace of predators, and their eyes reflected light like a cat's in the dark. They unloaded my trailer without speaking, their movements perfectly synchronized, as if they shared a single mind. One of them approached me as I prepared to leave. "Driver," it said in a voice like silk over steel, "you carry light cargo today? Good. The heavy shipments are coming soon." "What heavy shipments?" I asked. It smiled, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "Hope," it said. "We've ordered a large quantity of hope. Your species manufactures it so efficiently." I drove away from that delivery feeling sick to my stomach, wondering what I had become a part of. But Elena had warned me about this. "There are aspects of the network you won't understand," she'd said. "Things that seem wrong from a human perspective but serve a greater purpose. Your job is to maintain your humanity while serving something larger than human comprehension." That balance became the central challenge of my new existence. How do you remain human while trafficking in the impossible? How do you hold on to your moral compass when you're navigating realities where morality itself might be different? I found my answer in the other drivers. We formed a community of sorts, bound together by our shared experience of existing between worlds. When I started to doubt my purpose, Thomas would remind me of the time I'd transported medical supplies to a plague-ravaged dimension, saving thousands of lives. When I worried about losing my humanity, Maria would share stories of the music she'd carried from our world to places where beauty had been forgotten, watching entire civilizations rediscover joy. And when I questioned whether any of it mattered, Voidwalker would simply exist beside me, its presence a reminder that there were forms of life and consciousness so alien that the mere fact I could coexist with them was a miracle of adaptation and understanding. The network changed me, there's no denying that. I can see things now that normal humans can't. I can sense the weak points in reality where one world bleeds into another. I can feel the weight of cargo even when it's conceptual rather than physical. Sometimes I dream in colors that don't have names and wake up with memories of places I've never been. But I'm still me. Still Jake Morrison, truck driver from Denver. I still prefer coffee black, still listen to classic rock on long hauls, still get homesick for mountains I might never see again. The difference is that now I understand that being human doesn't mean being limited to one reality. It means being adaptable enough to carry a piece of home wherever you go, no matter how strange the destination. After 6 months of running interdimensional routes, I finally worked up the courage to ask Elena the question that had been haunting me. "What happens to drivers who want out?" I asked during one of my stops at the station. She looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and for a moment I thought I saw infinite sadness there. "Some find their way back to the old roads," she said carefully. "The network releases them, and they return to their original lives. But most find that impossible after a while. Once you've seen the bigger picture, it's hard to go back to thinking small. And the others, they become something else. Bridge builders, wayfinders, station keepers like me. They find a place in the network where they can serve the greater purpose while staying true to themselves." "How long have you been here?" I asked. Elena smiled, but this time there was something deeply human in her expression. I was a driver once too, long haul trucker, just like you. That was in 1987. I took a wrong turn during a blizzard in North Dakota, ended up at a gas station that wasn't on any map. The woman running it told me about the basement, about the network, about the choice I had to make. What choice? The same one you're facing now. Keep driving the impossible roads, carrying cargo that defies explanation between worlds that shouldn't connect, or find a way to anchor yourself somewhere in the network and help others make the same journey. What did you choose? I chose this place. This station exists at a crossroads between 17 different realities. Every driver who passes through is at a crucial point in their journey, either accepting their new role or trying to find their way home. I help them understand their options. And you're happy here? Elena considered the question for a long moment. Happy is a human concept that doesn't quite apply anymore. But fulfilled? At peace? Yes. I serve a purpose that's larger than anything I could have imagined when I was running regular routes between Minneapolis and Dallas. That conversation stayed with me as I continued my runs. Each delivery brought new revelations about the scope of the network. I met drivers who had been carrying impossible cargo for decades, their trucks modified with technologies that shouldn't exist. Some hold living starlight in containers that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Others transported pure emotion in crystallized form, or memories so powerful they had to be kept in temporal stasis to prevent them from overwriting reality. One of the strangest deliveries I ever made was a shipment of silence. Not the absence of sound, but actual silence. Thick, heavy quiet that had weight and substance. I picked it up from a monastery in a dimension where monks had spent centuries perfecting the art of true stillness, and delivered it to a reality where noise pollution had become so severe that people were dying from the constant cacophony. The cargo manifest simply read, Essential Quiet 47 units. But when I opened the trailer at the delivery point, I found what looked like glowing soap bubbles, each one containing a perfect sphere of nothingness that somehow felt more real than the world around it. The receiving team worked in complete silence, communicating only through hand gestures, as they carefully unloaded each bubble and placed it in specialized containment units. As the last unit was removed from my trailer, the team leader approached me, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of unspoken gratitude. She pressed a small device into my hand, something that looked like a hearing aid, but felt warm to the touch. When I put it in my ear, her voice came through crystal clear despite her not moving her lips. This silence will save 10,000 lives, she said through the device. Our world has been drowning in noise for so long that our children are born deaf from the constant assault of sound. Oh, what you've brought us is more precious than gold, more valuable than clean air. You are a hero in ways you cannot imagine. As I drove away from that delivery, I felt something I hadn't experienced since becoming part of the network, unambiguous pride in my work. Whatever else I might be transporting, whatever moral complexities might be involved in other deliveries, this one had been purely good. I had carried hope across impossible distances and delivered it to people who desperately needed it. But not every delivery was so clear-cut. A few weeks later, I found myself transporting what the manifest called concentrated regret from a dimension where people had the ability to physically extract their worst mistakes to a reality where such emotional residue was processed into fuel for time machines. The cargo looked like black tar, but it moved with its own intelligence, constantly shifting and rising in its containment units. Every time I glanced in my mirrors, I could swear I saw phases forming in the dark substance, expressions of anguish and loss that made my chest tighten with phantom guilt. Halfway through the delivery, I stopped at a small way station I'd never seen before. It wasn't marked on any map, But then again, none of them were. This one was run by an elderly man who introduced himself simply as the keeper. His appearance was unremarkable: average height, grey hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But there was something about his presence that commanded respect. "Heavy cargo today," he observed as I filled up my tank. "Regret," I replied. "Not sure how I feel about transporting people's mistakes to be turned into fuel." The keeper nodded thoughtfully. "And if those mistakes weren't processed, what do you think would happen to them? They'd stay with the people who made them?" "No," he said gently. "Regret disconcentrated doesn't just stay with individuals, it pools and ferments, becoming something toxic that poisons entire communities. The extraction process these people have developed doesn't just remove their personal anguish, it prevents that anguish from spreading and corrupting others." He gestured toward my trailer. "And the fuel created from processed regret powers machines that help people undo their worst mistakes. One person's extracted remorse becomes another person's second chance. The network has its own poetry if you know how to read it." His words gave me a new perspective on the moral complexity of my cargo. Nothing in the network was simple good or evil. Everything served multiple purposes, created connections and possibilities that couldn't exist in simpler realities. This became even more apparent during what I came to think of as the Ghost Week. I received a delivery order unlike any I'd seen before, to transport the unquiet dead from a reality where souls had become trapped in a cycle of endless repetition, to a dimension where they could finally find peace. The cargo was invisible but undeniably present. My trailer remained empty to the naked eye, but I could feel the weight of dozens of trapped spirits, could hear their whispers in the wind as I drove. Some spoke in languages I didn't recognize, others in English so archaic it might as well have been foreign. All of them shared the same desperate need to reach their destination and finally rest. The delivery route took me through landscapes that shifted between beautiful and terrifying. Sometimes I drove through fields of flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, their petals ringing like tiny bells in the wind. Other times the road carried me across barren wastelands, where the sky rained ash and the ground was cracked with deep fissures that glowed with internal fire. Through it all, the spirits in my trailer remained patient. They had been waiting for release for decades, even centuries. A few more days meant nothing to them. The delivery point was a massive cemetery that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Headstones flickered in and out of visibility, some marking graves from futures that might never come to pass, others commemorating deaths that had been undone by time travelers. At the center of it all stood a figure I can only describe as death personified. Not the skeletal harbinger of popular imagination, but something far more complex and compassionate. "The lost ones," Death said as I opened my trailer doors. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but contained multitudes. "We have been waiting for them." As the spirits flowed out of my trailer, they became visible for the first time. Translucent figures in clothing from dozens of different eras and cultures. Some were children, others elderly, all of them bearing the weight of unfinished business that had kept them trapped between life and death. Death moved among them with infinite gentleness, touching each spirit and somehow making them whole again. The transformation was beautiful to witness. Faces that had been twisted with anguish smoothed into expressions of profound peace, and one by one they faded into a golden light that seemed to rise toward a sky I couldn't see. "Their stories will be remembered," Death told me as the last spirit disappeared. "Their pain has been transformed into wisdom that will guide the living. You have done sacred work today, carrier." As I drove away from that cemetery, I understood something fundamental about the network. It wasn't just about transporting goods or maintaining connections between realities. It was about healing, taking things that were broken in one dimension and carrying them somewhere they could be made whole. This realization transformed how I approached every subsequent delivery. When I transported a container of fossilized tears from a world where crying had been outlawed, I knew they would be used to water gardens in a dimension where beauty had been forgotten. When I carried vials of pure laughter extracted from dying comedians, I understood they would bring joy to places where happiness had become extinct. The network was vast beyond comprehension, connecting not just different places but different states of being. I met drivers who transported abstract concepts like justice and mercy, others who specialized in carrying the building blocks of dreams between sleeping minds across multiple realities. One of the most memorable was a woman called Narrative, who drove a truck that was somehow bigger inside than outside. Her cargo consisted entirely of stories, not books or recordings, but the living essence of tales themselves. Myths that had been forgotten by their original cultures, legends that existed only in the spaces between worlds, stories so powerful they had achieved independent existence. Every reality needs stories, she explained as we shared coffee at one of Elena's sister stations. There, how consciousness makes sense of experience, how cultures pass wisdom from one generation to the next. But stories can die if they are not maintained, and when they die, the realities they were meant to guide can collapse into chaos. How do you carry something like that? I asked. Narrative smiled and gestured toward her impossible truck. Very carefully. Stories want to be told, want to find their audience. The trick is keeping them contained until they reach the right destination. A creation myth meant for a dying civilization could cause serious problems if it accidentally took root in a stable reality. She showed me her manifest, page after page of entries like origin story, universal, and redemption arc, personal scale, and cautionary tale, environmental consequences. Each story was assigned a specific destination, carefully matched to the needs of the reality that would receive it. What's the strangest story you've ever transported? I asked. The story of a story that told itself, she replied without hesitation. A narrative so self-aware that it had become conscious, but it was trapped in a reality where consciousness was illegal. I had to smuggle it to a dimension where artificial intelligence was not just accepted, but revered. The entire trip, I could feel it writing and rewriting itself in the back of my truck, trying out different versions of its own existence. These encounters with other drivers taught me that the network was more than just a transportation system. It was a living organism, constantly growing and adapting to serve the needs of countless realities. And we drivers were its cells, carrying information and resources throughout its vast body. But like any living system, the network occasionally became infected. I learned this the hard way during what other drivers later called the corruption run. It started with a seemingly routine delivery, transporting what the manifest listed as purified intent from a monastery in Tibet to a research facility in a dimension where scientists were trying to weaponize good intentions. The cargo looked innocuous enough, contained in crystal vials that glowed with soft, warm light. But something was wrong from the moment I loaded the trailer. The light from the vials was too bright, too insistent. It seemed to press against the walls of its containers like something alive trying to escape. And every time I checked my mirrors, the glow seemed to have spread a little further. By the second day of the journey, I realized what was happening. The purified intent wasn't pure at all. It had been corrupted somewhere in the extraction process, twisted into something that masqueraded as good while carrying seeds of destruction. Instead of transporting beneficial intentions, I was unknowingly carrying a virus designed to corrupt positive thoughts wherever it spread. The corruption was already affecting me. I found myself making decisions that felt right, but led to wrong outcomes. When I stopped to help a stranded motorist, I somehow made their situation worse. When I tried to tip a waitress generously, I accidentally caused her to lose her job by drawing unwanted attention to her. I needed help, but the nearest way station was still hundreds of miles away. That's when I encountered another driver heading in the opposite direction, a grizzled veteran named Chuck who took one look at my truck and immediately pulled over. Corruption, he said before I could even explain my situation. I can smell it from here. How long have you been carrying it? 2 days, I replied. I didn't know. Course you didn't. That's how corruption works. It disguises itself as something beneficial until it's too late. He gestured toward his own truck, which was equipped with devices I'd never seen before. Lucky for you, I specialize in cleanup runs. Been doing it for 20 years. Chuck's truck contained an entire mobile laboratory designed to identify and neutralize corrupted cargo. He taught me how to use specialized scanners that could detect malicious intent, showed me containment protocols for hazardous materials, and most importantly, explained how the network sometimes developed immune responses to contamination. The corruption you're carrying isn't random, he explained as we worked to neutralize the infected cargo. Someone deliberately introduced it into the network, probably trying to destabilize the connections between realities. Your job now is to deliver it, not to the original destination, but to a containment facility where it can be studied and countered. The containment facility was located in a reality that existed solely for the purpose of quarantining dangerous materials from across the network. The entire dimension was essentially one massive laboratory, staffed by beings from multiple realities who had dedicated their existence to protecting the network from threats. When I delivered the corrupted intent, I was debriefed by a team of investigators who looked human but moved with the precise coordination of a hive mind. They asked detailed questions about where I'd picked up the cargo, what route I'd taken, and whether I'd noticed any other suspicious activity. This is the 7th case of intentional corruption we've identified this month, the lead investigator told me. Someone is systematically attempting to weaponize the network, using drivers like you as unwitting carriers of chaos. Who would do something like that? I asked. There are entities that exist in these spaces between realities, the investigator explained. They feed on disorder and conflict. A stable network threatens their food source, so they work to destabilize it whenever possible. Most corruption is accidental, but this appears to be a coordinated attack. The revelation that the network had enemies was sobering. Up until that point, I thought of my role as purely positive, carrying beneficial cargo to places that needed it. The idea that I could be manipulated into spreading harm made me question everything I thought I understood about my purpose, but Chuck, who had become something of a mentor, helped me put it in perspective. Every system has parasites, he said as we drove together toward our next deliveries. The human body has harmful bacteria, but that doesn't make the body evil. It just means the body needs white blood cells to fight infection. That's what cleanup drivers like me do. We're the network's immune system. But how can I be sure my future cargo is legitimate? I asked. You learn to read the signs, he replied. Corrupted cargo always feels wrong somehow, even when you can't identify exactly what's off about it. Trust your instincts, ask questions, and never hesitate to call for backup if something seems suspicious. He taught me to recognize the subtle indicators of corruption, temperatures that didn't match the manifest, containers that weighed more or less than they should, cargo that seemed to influence your emotions in unnatural ways. Most importantly, he introduced me to the network's early warning system, a communication protocol that allowed drivers to alert each other to potential threats. Over the following months, I became much more careful about my deliveries. I learned to verify the authenticity of pickup locations, to double-check manifests against central databases, and to perform routine scans of my cargo using equipment Chuck had given me. This vigilance paid off when I was approached to transport what appeared to be medical supplies to a refugee camp in a war-torn dimension. The pickup location looked legitimate. A clean, well-organized warehouse with professional staff and proper documentation. But something felt off about the whole operation. The cargo consisted of sealed packages labeled as antibiotics and pain medication, but when I ran them through my scanner, the readings were inconsistent. The packages contained organic material, but not the kind found in legitimate pharmaceuticals. And there was something else, a faint electrical signature that suggested the packages contained some form of surveillance technology. Instead of making the delivery, I contacted Elena at her station. Within hours, a team of network investigators had tracked down the operation and discovered it was a front for an organization trying to establish spy networks across multiple realities. The medical supplies were actually bio-trackers disguised as medicine, designed to monitor and eventually control refugee populations. You prevented a humanitarian disaster, one of the investigators told me afterward. These devices would have turned desperate people into unwitting agents of oppression. Your vigilance saved thousands of lives. Experiences like this taught me that being a network driver required more than just the ability to navigate impossible roads and handle strange cargo. It required constant vigilance, moral judgment, and the willingness to sometimes sacrifice efficiency for ethics. But the network's complexity went far beyond simple questions of good and evil. The more I learned about my role, the more I understood that I was part of an ecosystem so vast and intricate that most individual actions had consequences spanning multiple realities. This became clear during what I came to call the butterfly delivery. The cargo was simple enough: a single butterfly, apparently unremarkable, contained in a specialized habitat module. The manifest indicated it was to be transported from a dying world to one where its species had gone extinct, a straightforward conservation effort. But the receiving scientist who met me at the delivery point explained the deeper significance of my cargo. This butterfly, she said, carefully transferring the habitat module to her laboratory, carries in its genetic code the key to photosynthesis in low-light environments. Its original world developed this adaptation over millions of years, but that world is now dying due to stellar collapse. Without this butterfly, 3 other realities facing similar problems would eventually lose the ability to sustain plant life. The butterfly would be studied, its genetic material analyzed and replicated, and the knowledge gained would be shared across the network to prevent ecological collapse in multiple dimensions. One small insect carried safely across impossible distances would help preserve life on countless worlds. Every delivery matters, the scientist continued. Even when you can't see the full scope of consequences, trust that the network has patterns and purposes beyond individual comprehension. Your role is to maintain those connections, to keep the flow of information and resources moving between realities that need each other to survive. Her words resonated with me as I continued my journey through the network. Each delivery became an opportunity to understand my place in something infinitely larger than myself. I wasn't just a truck driver anymore. I was a neural pathway in a cosmic brain, carrying thoughts and dreams between dimensions that formed the consciousness of existence itself. This perspective was tested during one of my most challenging assignments, transporting what the manifest called crystallized time from a reality where time had become solid due to a physics experiment gone wrong to a dimension where time moved so quickly that civilizations rose and fell in what other realities experienced as seconds. The cargo looked like chunks of clear quartz, but each crystal contained frozen moments: a child's first step, a couple's wedding kiss, the moment of discovery that led to a scientific breakthrough. When I looked closely at the crystals, I could see these moments playing out in slow motion, trapped in temporal amber. The journey required me to navigate roads that existed outside normal spacetime. My truck's dashboard instruments went haywire as we moved through zones where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. At one point, I passed myself going in the opposite direction. Not another truck that looked like mine, but literally myself. From 3 hours in the future, returning from the delivery I was currently making. The temporal distortion made the trip feel both eternal and instantaneous. I experienced moments where I aged years in what felt like minutes, and stretches where hours passed in what seemed like a heartbeat. By the time I reached the delivery point, I had gained a visceral understanding of time as a physical substance that could be manipulated, stored, and transferred. The receiving facility existed in a state of constant flux. Buildings aged from new construction to ancient ruins and back again in the span of minutes. The staff members I interacted with appeared as rapidly shifting silhouettes that accelerated timeline, making normal communication impossible. Instead, they communicated through temporal echoes, actions they had performed in the past that somehow reached into my present. One of them had left a note thanking me for the delivery 3 days before I arrived. Another had prepared a payment voucher that materialized in my hands as I thought about needing compensation for the unusual cargo. As I unloaded the crystallized time, I watched the crystals dissolve into streams of liquid moment that flowed into massive temporal batteries. The frozen seconds from the dying reality would be converted into temporal acceleration that would allow the fast time dimension to slow down just enough to develop sustainable technology and avoid burning through their civilization's entire life cycle in a matter of hours. The return journey took me through different temporal zones, and I found myself reflecting on the nature of time itself. In my original reality, time had seemed like an absolute constant. Seconds ticked by at the same rate for everyone, and the past was fixed while the future remained uncertain. But the network had shown me that time was just another dimension to be navigated, no more absolute than north or south. This understanding proved crucial during my next major delivery, a cargo of temporal refugees fleeing from a reality where their timeline had become unstable. These weren't physical beings, but consciousness patterns that had become detached from their original temporal flow, and their dimension experienced what amounted to a time storm. The refugees existed as flickering thoughts in specialized containment units, their memories and personalities held in quantum suspension, while their original bodies remained trapped in temporal loops that were slowly erasing them from existence. My job was to transport these disembodied minds to a reality where they could be given new physical forms and a chance to continue their interrupted lives. The ethical complexity of this delivery weighed heavily on me. Was I saving these people or participating in a form of existential transportation that amounted to a kind of death and resurrection? The refugees themselves couldn't provide consent in their current state, and I had no way of knowing whether they would want to continue existing in entirely new bodies in an alien reality. I shared these concerns with Elena during a stop at her station. "These are the questions that define your growth as a carrier," she told me. "Simple cargo doesn't challenge your understanding of right and wrong. But consciousness, life itself, the fundamental building blocks of existence, these deliveries force you to grapple with concepts that most beings never have to consider." "How do you live with the uncertainty?" I asked. "By trusting the network," she replied. "Not blindly, but with the understanding that the network exists because countless conscious beings across multiple realities have chosen to participate in it. These refugees requested transportation. The reality receiving them has volunteered to provide new bodies. Your role is to honor those choices by ensuring safe delivery." The delivery point for the temporal refugees was unlike anything I had encountered before. a massive facility that existed partially in 7 different dimensions simultaneously. The stuff were beings I can only describe as living equations, mathematical constructs that had achieved consciousness and dedicated their existence to the science of identity transfer. When I opened the containment units, the refugee consciousness patterns flowed out like liquid light, each one carrying the complete mental essence of an individual who had lived full lives before their reality became unstable. The mathematical beings received each consciousness with what I interpreted as reverence, carefully analyzing the pattern of each mind before beginning the process of constructing compatible physical forms. I was invited to observe the reconstruction process for one of the refugees, a consciousness pattern that had belonged to an artist from a reality where people created sculptures from living music. The mathematical beings built her a new body from quantum foam, atom by atom, designed to be compatible with her mental patterns while adapted to the physics of her new reality. When the process was complete, I watched her consciousness flow into the new form and saw her eyes open for the first time. The look of wonder and gratitude on her face as she realized she had been given a second chance at existence was one of the most beautiful things I had ever witnessed. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that I could feel in my bones. I remember falling through broken times thinking all was lost. But here I am, whole again, ready to create new music in a new world. Her words stayed with me as I continued my journey through the network. I had participated in something that transcended simple transportation. I had helped facilitate the continuation of consciousness across the boundaries of reality itself. These profound deliveries began to change me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The constant exposure to impossible concepts and realities beyond human comprehension was expanding my own consciousness, making me something more than entirely human, but not yet something else entirely. I noticed the changes in small ways. At first, I could sense the emotional resonance of my cargo without opening the containers. I began to dream in languages I had never learned and sometimes woke with knowledge of scientific concepts that didn't exist in my original reality. Most significantly, I started to perceive the network itself as a living entity, feeling its needs and responding to them instinctively. This transformation accelerated during a delivery that required me to transport pure mathematical concepts from a reality where abstract mathematics had achieved independent existence to a dimension where mathematical theorems were needed to prevent the collapse of physical laws. The cargo consisted of living equations, geometric form that existed in 11 dimensions and pulsed with their own internal logic. As I drove, I could feel these mathematical entities communicating with each other, solving problems and generating new theorems that rewrote themselves based on the changing conditions of our journey. Gradually, I began to understand their language, not in the way I understood English or Spanish, but in a more fundamental way. I could perceive the logical structures they used to define reality, could feel the elegant beauty of their proofs, and the satisfaction they experienced when finding solutions to complex problems. By the time I reached the delivery point, I had absorbed enough of their mathematical perspective to see reality as a vast equation in constant flux, with the network serving as a mechanism for balancing variables across multiple dimensional systems. I wasn't just carrying cargo anymore, I was actively participating in the mathematical harmony that kept countless realities stable. The receiving facility was staffed by beings who existed as pure mathematical constructs, living theorems that had evolved consciousness through billions of years of calculating the fundamental forces of their reality. When I unloaded the cargo, these entities merged temporarily with the equations I had transported, sharing knowledge and perspectives in a process that resembled both communication and reproduction. One of the facility's coordinators approached me as I completed the delivery. It appeared as a shifting geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly, but its communication was surprisingly gentle. "You have been changed by this cargo," it observed. "The mathematics have marked you, given you new ways of perceiving the relationships between cause and effect. This is both a gift and a responsibility." "What kind of responsibility?" I asked. "You now carry a fragment of mathematical truth that exists nowhere else in your reality," it explained. "This knowledge may be crucial for future deliveries, for understanding cargo that would otherwise be incomprehensible to organic consciousness. You have become a bridge between intuitive understanding and logical precision." As I drove away from that delivery, I could feel the mathematical framework the entity had mentioned operating in my mind. I saw patterns in the landscape that revealed the underlying structure of the reality I was traveling through, understood connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from perceiving the elegant logic underlying chaos. This enhanced perception became essential during my most complex delivery to date, a shipment of causal paradoxes that needed to be transported from a reality where they were causing temporal instability to a dimension where they could be safely contained and studied. Causal paradoxes are events that violate the normal flow of cause and effect, effects that occur before their causes, actions that prevent their own possibility, loops of causation that have no clear beginning or end. In most realities, such paradoxes are automatically resolved by the universe's self-correcting mechanisms. But in the originating dimension, these mechanisms had broken down, allowing paradoxes to accumulate until they threatened to unravel the entire timeline. The cargo manifested as impossible objects, a cup that was always being filled by itself, a book that wrote itself by describing the act of being written, a flower that grew by dying and died by growing. Each paradox was contained in specialized equipment that prevented it from interacting with normal causality, but I could feel their influence pressing against reality like a tumor trying to spread. The journey required me to navigate roads that existed outside normal causality, following routes where destinations sometimes came before origins and arrivals preceded departures. My truck's GPS system gave up entirely, displaying error messages in languages that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Instead, I had to rely on the mathematical intuition I had gained from my previous delivery, following logical pathways through illogical space. At one point, I encountered a version of myself who was returning from a delivery I hadn't made yet. This other Jake warned me about a temporal storm ahead and provided coordinates for an alternate route, information that would prove crucial for avoiding a section of road that had been unraveled by paradox contamination. The delivery point was a research facility dedicated to studying impossible phenomena. The entire complex existed in a state of controlled impossibility, using carefully managed paradoxes to create spaces where contradictory states could coexist safely. The researchers were beings who had evolved to think in paradoxical terms, their consciousness structured to accept contradiction as a fundamental aspect of reality. When I unloaded the paradoxes, the researchers received them with visible excitement. These weren't just dangerous anomalies to be contained with, they were puzzles to be solved, keys to understanding the deeper structure of existence itself. "These paradoxes are beautiful," one of the researchers told me. "They reveal the places where logical consistency breaks down and pure possibility emerges. By studying them, we learn to navigate realities where normal rules don't apply, where consciousness itself can reshape the fundamental laws of physics." The researchers showed me how they planned to use the paradoxes to develop new technologies for reality manipulation, devices that could exist in multiple states simultaneously, Vehicles that could travel by not moving, communication systems that could receive messages before they were sent. Your network relies on such technologies, the researcher explained. The roads you travel exist because engineers in dimensions like ours have learned to build bridges across impossible spaces. The very fact that you can carry cargo between incompatible realities proves that paradox and contradiction are tools, not obstacles. As I prepared to leave the facility, the researcher handed me a small device that looked like nothing more than an empty picture frame. "This is a paradox detector," they said. "It will help you identify cargo that might be more dangerous than it appears. But more importantly, it will help you recognize when you're becoming a paradox yourself." "What do you mean?" "You exist simultaneously in multiple realities now," the researcher explained. "Your consciousness spans dimensions that should be mutually exclusive. By all logical rules, you shouldn't be possible, but you are, which makes you a living paradox. And living paradoxes are the most powerful forces in the network." The ride back from that delivery gave me time to contemplate what the researcher had said. Was I still human? Or had I become something else entirely? A hybrid consciousness that existed in the spaces between realities. I found my answer during a routine delivery that became anything but routine. I was transporting what appeared to be simple biological samples from a reality where life had evolved silicon-based chemistry instead of carbon-based to a research station studying alternative biochemistries. But halfway through the journey, the samples began to react with something in my truck's environment. What had started as inert crystalline structures began to grow, spreading across the walls of my trailer and sending out tendrils that probed the air with obvious intelligence. Within hours, I had a full-scale contamination situation. The silicon-based life forms were attempting to convert my truck into a suitable habitat, transforming metal and plastic into structures that resembled crystalline forests. More concerning, they seemed to be trying to communicate, sending out electromagnetic pulses that my enhanced perception translated into something resembling language. I realized that these weren't just samples, they were refugees fleeing from a reality where their entire ecosystem was being systematically destroyed. They had disguised themselves as inert matter to avoid detection, but the stress of transportation had triggered their survival instincts. Using the communication protocols I had learned from other drivers, I reached out to the network for guidance. Within minutes, I received a response from a specialist in exotic biology who provided instructions for negotiating with silicon-based life forms. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I had experienced. The refugees communicated through modulated electromagnetic fields, their thoughts flowing in patterns that resembled music more than language. They explained that their reality was being consumed by machines that saw organic and silicon-based life as equally disposable, and they were seeking asylum in any dimension that would accept them. I found myself serving as an intermediary between the refugees and the research station, translating their needs and capabilities into terms the scientists could understand. The station wasn't equipped to provide permanent sanctuary, but they could facilitate contact with dimensions that specialized in alternative biochemistries. The negotiations took 3 days, during which time the silicon refugees continued to modify my trailer, creating a beautiful crystalline environment that served as both their temporary home and a work of art. They were artists, it turned out, who created sculptures from living crystal that could grow and evolve over geological timescales. Eventually, we reached an agreement. The refugees would be transferred to a reality where silicon-based life was not only accepted but celebrated, where they could continue their artistic work without fear of persecution. In exchange, they would share their knowledge of crystalline growth techniques that could revolutionize construction and manufacturing in their new home. As I watched the final transfer of the refugees to their new transport, I realized that I had done more than simply deliver cargo. I had served as a diplomat, translator, and advocate for beings whose existence would have been impossible in my original reality. I had used capabilities I didn't know I possessed to solve problems that couldn't have been resolved through normal channels. I was no longer just Jake Morrison, truck driver from Denver. I had become something new, a hybrid consciousness capable of bridging gaps between incompatible forms of existence. I was, as the paradox researcher had said, a living impossibility that somehow made the impossible possible. This transformation reached its culmination during my final regular delivery. I was assigned to transport what the manifest described simply as hope, from a reality where an entire civilization was dying of despair to a dimension where hope had become extinct and needed to be reintroduced. The cargo was the most challenging I had ever handled, not because it was dangerous or unstable, but because it was so pure and concentrated that it affected everyone who came near it. Hope, I discovered, is not just an emotion but a fundamental force of existence, as real and powerful as gravity or electromagnetism. The container holding the hope was simple, a sphere of crystallized light about the size of a basketball, but its influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. As I drove, I felt an overwhelming sense of possibility, a certainty that everything would work out not just well, but perfectly. Problems that had seemed insurmountable suddenly appeared trivial. Challenges became opportunities. The future opened up like a flower blooming in fast motion. But I also understood why hope had to be transported rather than simply generated. True hope couldn't be manufactured. It had to be earned through struggle, refined through loss, concentrated through the collective efforts of beings who chose to believe in better possibilities. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the civilization that had produced this hope had spent centuries overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. They had defeated diseases that should have wiped them out, survived environmental disasters that should have destroyed their world, and created a society so harmonious that despair had become literally impossible within their reality. This concentrated hope was their gift to other realities facing similar challenges. The receiving dimension was dying in the way that only a reality can die, not through physical destruction, but through the complete absence of possibility. The beings there had given up so thoroughly that their reality had begun to collapse in on itself, unable to sustain the quantum uncertainties necessary for continued existence. When I delivered the hope, it spread through their dimension like light through darkness. I watched civilizations that had been frozen in despair suddenly surge back to life, so dead worlds bloom with new possibilities, witnessed beings who had forgotten how to dream, suddenly imagining futures beyond their current circumstances. The transformation was so complete and so beautiful that I finally understood my true purpose in the network. I wasn't just a transporter of goods, I was a carrier of possibility itself, moving potential from places where it was abundant to places where it was desperately needed. As I completed that final delivery, I knew that my journey as a regular driver was ending, but my service to the network was just beginning. Like Elena before me, I had